this is Rakdos. Today I'm going to bring you something a little bit different. On my last video where I talked about the tier list of the painting techniques, a good friend of mine recommended that I do some content on some of my other hobbies, especially since I don't have all that many models to paint at the moment. So I took his advice, and today I bring you a deck breakdown of my best Magic the Gathering deck that I've made to date, I believe. So, without further ado, let me explain Jeleva, the Nephalia Scourge. Before we get into the deck, I have to give you a disclaimer. I haven't purchased Magic cards in a very, very long time. The collection I'm working with is a collection that I've had for several years. I believe I started collecting in Tempest and went on and off with Magic throughout my life, but nonetheless it is incredibly strong, and today I'd like to talk to you about how I built it and its interactions. Here she is, Jeleva. I've had many Magic the Gathering Commander decks in my life, but at this point in time I do feel like she is my strongest. Just based on the games that I've played since I've had her, and the just amount of interaction that she gets to have with your opponents and your opponent's cards. You definitely want to build her open-endedly with a lot of room for her to take combos from your opponent's deck and let those cards that you know they're going to have synergize with your own, and you can create some win conditions that your deck never originally had and kind of come up out of nowhere. The last game I played with her, I do believe I won on like turn 6 or something like that with some cheesy combo, but we're going to go into that. So I did not include the mana rocks or the mana base in the deck. I'm going to leave that up to you guys. Any halfway decent mana base with some good mana rocks and acceleration will be able to make her work real good. And I'm going to try to go over each of the cards and each of the sections that I've laid them out in to help understand how each of the cards interact. Because there's a lot of sneaky interactions between the cards, and it's not as intuitive at first glance. This video is probably going to sound like alien language to people who do not play the game of Magic, so I apologize for that. But without further ado, let's get into it. Alright, so she has an incredible effect. When she enters the battlefield, each player exiles the top X cards of their deck, where X is the amount of mana spent to cast her. So the first time that she comes in, it will be 4. If she ends up dying or leaving the battlefield and being put back in the command zone, that cost will increase to 6, and then to 8, and then to 10, and so on and so forth. This general actually incentivizes your opponent to leave her on the battlefield and not kill her instantly, unlike most of the commanders in the format. She can actually totally whiff and not get any instants or sorceries on her first cast, and it's highly incentivized for your opponent to leave her there. Thankfully, with the rest of the deck, we can do that all ourselves. So the 2 cards I have next to her, 3, I have Lightning Greaves and Swiftfoot Boots over here, because they are integral to the deck. Jeleva with haste is one of the scariest things that you can ever really imagine. She can get some of the most crazy powerful spells under her in the first cast, and if she can use those immediately without your opponent having much chance to react, you can just win the game outright. I didn't fill the deck with too many hasting cards because you don't want it to be over redundant. You don't want to have too many haste enablers. If you draw too many of them, it can cause your deck to have some trouble. The card over here is Acheron's Scepter. This card actually is good in almost every deck that uses instants. When it comes into play, you can remove an instant card with converted mana cost 2 or less from your hand from the game. That card gets imprinted on Acheron's Scepter, and then as an instant, you can tap 2 of anything and tap it and copy the card that you imprinted on it. Over here are my powerful instants that I use with Iceron Scepter. Disdainful Stroke, Arcane Denial, and Memory Lapse are all counterspells. They're the only counterspells I have in my deck. You don't want this deck to be too loaded up with counterspells. I suppose you could, but when you hit a counterspell with her come into play effect, it doesn't feel too great. It's kind of a lot of work to get it back at that point. The first card here I have is Shred Memory. You won't likely put this on Iceron Scepter, removing 4 cards from a single graveyard from the game. It's really in the deck for its transmute ability. I can pay 3 mana total and discard it from my hand to search my deck for any card that costs exactly 2 mana. In the game of Commander, we all know that things that let you search your deck to fetch for other cards are incredibly powerful. The 2-drop spot is specifically favorable for this deck, as we can instantly fetch counter magic. We can instantly fetch cards that allow us to more manipulate the top of our deck, like Brainstorm, which helps us combo off with our commander a little bit easier. We can search for incredibly powerful cards like Cyclonic Rift, and then use those for their overload cost to wipe the board, essentially. And I just love having specific cards like Diabolic Edict in the deck, just so I can kill my own Jeleva by targeting myself and allowing myself to sacrifice a creature. This happens a lot when I end up putting Lightning Greaves on Jeleva, and she'll have Shroud, which does make her a little bit harder for me to kill myself if she doesn't end up having any amazing instants or sorceries on her. Whew. Alright, so we're going to move over to the enchantments. There are only 3 of them. I run Phyrexian Arena, Rhystic Study, and Burning Sands. Phyrexian Arena isn't the best draw enchantment out there, for sure. I definitely could have a better substitute in the deck, and it's a card that I had on hand. Rhystic Study, everybody knows what Rhystic Study does. That card is incredible in Commander. And Burning Sands is a favorite of mine. It's not a super common card, but because this deck runs very, very, very few creatures, the chances that it bites us back and ends up harming us is very slim. Plus, it can win the game all on its own against decks that are very reliant on sacrifice engines, where they will put a bunch of creatures out and sacrifice them to their own effects to do a bunch of shenanigans. Burning Sands kind of shuts that down altogether. Alright, going over to this side, a little bit more of the combo heavy. Spellbinder. I remember when this card came out, and it is not an incredibly impressive card and not too much seen in Commander, but it is one of my favorites for combos. It is another imprint card, a lot like Iceron Scepter. When it comes into play, you can remove an instant card from your hand from the game, imprinted on it, and you equip Spellbinder onto a creature. If the creature deals damage to a player, combat damage, you get to copy the imprinted card and cast it for free. These are the cards that are good on their own and very good defensively for the deck, but being put on Spellbinder turns them into whole different beasts altogether. So Recoil typically does not get put on Spellbinder, just a very good instant speed removal card. Ether Trade Winds, very, very similar. Very great to bounce their most powerful thing and return something of yours with a come into play effect, or maybe even Jeleva herself. If she doesn't have great instants and sorceries on her, you can make Ether Trade Winds do some double duty. Now for the really powerful instance. So Volcanic Offering. I won't be able to show all of these cards, so you may have to look them up if you're curious for their effects. So Volcanic Offering is a very powerful removal spell that destroys non-basic lands and creatures at the same time. Supplant Form is a removal spell as well that allows you to return creatures to their owner's hands and lets you make copies of them. The spell is way more powerful than it looks. In almost every Commander game, someone is going to have an outrageously powerful creature. Returning that to their hand and getting a copy for yourself is phenomenal. Wretched Confluence. This card does everything. It allows you to choose multiple modes and lets you pick from drawing cards to murdering creatures to returning creatures from your graveyard to your hand. All three modes are very powerful in this deck. And the final card, Savage Beating. I will have to show this one because it's just so good. You can only play it during combat. Creatures you control gain double strike until end of turn, or you can untap all your creatures and gain an additional combat phase. You can do both if you choose Entwine. So when I was young, I encountered a combo from somebody from my local game store who put this card on Spellbinder. If your opponent has no blockers and you have Savage Beating on Spellbinder, when you deal combat damage to your opponent, you copy Savage Beating, you untap all of your creatures, and you gain another attack step. Well, if they didn't have blockers the first time, it's likely they won't have them after this trigger, so then you attack them again and get the trigger again. You rinse and repeat, and you deal infinite damage to everyone at the table who has no blockers. Awesome. So we're going on over to the creatures. This deck only runs 8 creatures. I love this approach. I am very much a control player at heart, and running few creatures in your deck is very troublesome for your opponent because it will likely make a lot of their removal useless. They'll spend many turns with kill spells or destroy spells in their hands, and our general, as we've already discussed, likely isn't a great target for removal. So it does shut off a lot of your opponent's deck, but not only does it do that, each of these creatures are powerful for what they bring to the table. Dimir Infiltrator is a card that allows me to search my deck for another 2-cost card, very similar to the Shred Memory idea. And it also has a 2-mana cost, so as I said, the 2-mana cost spot being very, very, very valuable. Enclave Cryptologist, every deck needs early game of some kind, and this is one of the best looters that I've found. If you manage to draw on turn 1, you can get an incredible advantage. Drawing at late game isn't the greatest, but I still prefer it over other looting mechanisms. Thada, Adele Acquisitioner, this woman does work. If you manage to get her out on turn 3 or 4 in a multiplayer game, she will attract a lot of hate, and if no one deals with her, you will be able to snag some very powerful artifacts off of your opponent. Remember, we're playing Commander. Almost everyone has artifacts in their deck. Even if it's not a core way that their deck wins, they most likely will have at least a Soul Ring for you to take. Young Pyromancer. This creature has won me so many games. Not only will he get triggers for his 1/1 elementals when you cast spells with Jeleva, but just having him out or being able to copy him and having multiple copies of him, you can swarm the board very, very easily. He works great with a lot of spells your opponents have, and that's something to keep in mind, that this deck not only will be operating with its own cards, but it likely will be operating with instants and sorceries of your opponents as well. Spellbound Dragon. This one might seem like a confusing creature to have in the deck, but this card also has won me so many games. I am hard-pressed to find a 5-drop that can kill people as efficiently as Spellbound Dragon, especially when your deck doesn't do a lot of direct damage. You do want a creature that hits very, very hard. Spellbound Dragon can hit for 8 to 10 per swing. It's very, very powerful if you do have to just cast Savage Beating without the Spellbinder. Imagine a scenario where you have a Spellbound Dragon, you attack with it, you cast Savage Beating with the Entwine. It is now a 8/5 or a 10/5 with double strike, 20 damage in the air, and then you will also get to untap and attack again. That second attack will trigger its effect again, and it will gain even more power. So at the end of that second attack, it might be a 15. So you will end up dealing a total of 50 to 60 damage with a Spellbound Dragon and a Savage Beating combo, or an extra turn combo, which we'll get into in a moment. So we have Gutter Snipe. When you cast an instant or sorcery spell, deal 2 damage to each opponent. You do want stuff that hits everyone, just so you can hit the players that might have certain defensive countermeasures up. Gutter Snipe is also incredible to copy, and it does work very well with your opponent's cards as well when you do get a hold of those. If you have 5 or 10 Gutter Snipes on the board through copy effects, every single instant sorcery you play is just going to be devastating. Dualcaster Mage, there are other alternatives for Dualcaster Mage, just other things that copy spells when they come into play. He's not as essential, he's just what I use to kind of copy my big spells. And then the workhorse of the deck, Oblivion Sower. When it is cast, so even if it's countered, this effect will happen. Target opponent exiles top 4 cards of their library, then you put any number of lands that player owns from exile into the battlefield under your control. Well, our general exiles cards from the top of players' decks religiously. I will try to play Jeleva a couple times before I play Oblivion Sower if possible, but typically when I do drop this guy, he snags me about 4 or 5 lands minimum. These lands come into play untapped and can be used immediately. And with the deck's bounce mechanics and return mechanics, I can play Oblivion Sower a couple times per game, typically on every single player once. So my mana is just flooded. I have so many lands and can infinitely cast Jeleva if she's killed. Once it gets into the state where I have 20 plus mana, it's really hard to beat this deck. I can essentially just resort to casting Jeleva on my turn every turn until I win. Mention the extra turn mechanics. They're going to be sitting right over here. I have Walk the Aeons. Not the best take an extra turn spell by any means. There are a lot better ones out there. This one I just had on hand. If you do end up being put in the situation where you need to sacrifice the 3 islands to take an extra turn, you can do that just to squeeze out that little bit of extra value. And then the undeniable, probably one of the most powerful cards in the deck, Time Stretch. I have many times gotten Jeleva out on turn 4 with Lightning Greaves and had Time Stretch in my top 4 cards, and you just win. You just win. Your opponents will likely give up and won't even let you resolve the rest of the card, but you will find a way to win most of the time with those 2 extra turns you gain. I didn't flood the deck with extra turn cards because, for one, this deck has a lot of Tutors and Search. It has a lot of draw. You'll most likely run into one of the 2 of them in the game. And I didn't want to be too cheesy. Not a lot of players like losing to extra turns. Now we're going to move on to some more of the support cards and the general hate cards in the deck. Over here we have just our basic draw. Just standard cards, nothing special. Concentrate to draw 3. Faithless Looting, one of my favorite draw cards. Really good in this deck. You can trash stuff that you're not going to be using or that you can get back later, and it's very cheap. And Wheel of Fate. Wheel of Fate's an odd choice, but I have had several times where I can suspend Wheel of Fate, and right before it's about to go off, I can cast a spell like Evacuation or Cyclonic Rift and return all of my opponent's boards to their hand, and watch as they discard their entire board to the graveyard and draw an entire new hand of 7 cards. That's a very satisfying feeling for me. Some other just general hate, I really like Exhaustion. Exhaustion is very powerful for multiplayer games, for stealing a turn from players, essentially. It's very good if you can recur it and play it multiple times. It's just kind of an angry card. Some other general hate spells. Dreadbore. This deck has a very hard time dealing with Planeswalkers as it doesn't have a lot of attackers or direct damage, so having a card like this is pretty necessary. Wrecking Ball. In Commander, flexibility is key, and although this spell is not one of the most powerful removal spells, having the choice between a creature or a land is pretty strong. And then we have Chaos Warp, an undeniably strong spell. Very good for getting rid of permanents that you can't get rid of in other ways. It gets around a lot of different things, and for the most part, this deck doesn't care what they get off of the Chaos Warp. And Cabal Therapy, another one of my favorite cards. It's very good for killing Jeleva. The flashback Sacrifice a Creature is one of its most powerful effects. Just murdering Jeleva when she comes out and doesn't hit anything strong. You can cast Cabal Therapy, name the strongest card in your opponent's deck, look at their hand. Okay, they don't have it, but now you see their hand and you see the strongest card. you pay its flashback, sacrifice Jeleva, and name their strongest card. So it can be used very effectively, and for only 1 mana, it's too good to pass up. Alright, moving over here to some other support cards. We have our Tutors. Besides the Transmute Tutors that we have Demonic Tutor, just almost an auto-include in most black commander decks, and Fabricate. As I said, we really need to get out Lightning Greaves or Swiftfoot Boots in the game. It's also very good for going and fetching Spellbinder if you already have Savage Beating in your hand for that infinite combo. It can be great for pulling Aisharon Scepter if you already have a counterspell in your hand. Not infinite, but at least one per turn, which is very discouraging and very hard to get around in most cases. Then I have the board wipes. There are others such as the Evacuation and the Cyclonic Rift, but these are strong standalone board wipes. We have Blasphemous Act to murder the whole board for a very inexpensive amount of mana, especially if you're playing multiplayer typically. Incendiary Command, like I said, flexibility is key, and this card does a lot of different things to help remove your opponent's board. Decree of Pain, probably one of my favorite cards in all of Magic. Once you resolve a Decree of Pain, if the board was pretty congested at the time, it's very hard to lose after that. And then Crux of Fate. Crux of Fate is very good, especially because I do have 1 dragon in the deck. There have been times that I have chosen the non-dragon and just won the game with Spellbound Dragon sitting on the battlefield alone. Over here we have some other cards that just help the deck synergize together. Recoup gives in your sorcery card from your graveyard flashback. This is incredible because most of the very, very strong cards in the deck are sorceries, and you can end up casting a second Time Stretch or a second Walk of the Aeons with this card. The fact that it also has flashback is very, very powerful. Like I said, it's not unusual for this deck to get around 10 to 15 mana or lands per game, so being able to cast its flashback and then an expensive card is not difficult. Head games, this card is in here because I love it, but it is very good in multiplayer Commander. I have, in many cases, used Evacuation or Cyclonic Rift to return all of my opponent's cards to their hand, and then you head games them, get rid of all those cards, and give them a brand new hand of all lands. You're pretty much going to win the game after that. Rise and Fall, this card is pretty unassuming, but it does work. Let me turn this sideways actually here, so you can read. Returning a creature card in a graveyard and a creature card in play to their owner's hands. This is huge. You can return your opponent's biggest thing. You can return Jeleva to your hand. I have often returned Oblivion Sower from either the battlefield or the graveyard to my hand so that I can cast it on another player. I'll kill my own Oblivion Sower sometimes. Fall I don't use nearly as much, but in those niche situations where your opponent has very few cards in hand, or Rise is just not useful, you can cast Fall to just get a little bit more of an advantage. Now it's time for the Powerhouse cards. These cards just do amazing things and pretty much win the game when you play them. Spell Twine, I've loved this card since it was printed. This also plays off the idea of using your opponent's deck. Exile target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard and an opponent's graveyard, and you cast both of them without paying their mana cost. Needless to say, spell twining something like Time Stretch or any of these other incredibly powerful spells will put you so far ahead that it'll be very hard for your opponent to come back. Getting one from your opponent's graveyard as well is incredibly good. We're playing a format with high power cards, so the chances of you hitting something incredible from your opponent's deck is very high. Howl of the Horde. This card, it comes in clutch sometimes. It's maybe the least impressive card in the deck, I would say, but because my commander attacks to activate its effect, I can almost always assume that that raid ability is going to be coming into play. Even if it doesn't, copying the next instant or sorcery spell you cast is just strong. Rite of Replication. Probably the card that has won me the most games out of nowhere. Remember, this can copy opponent's creatures as well. This format has some of the strongest cards in the entire game in it, and if you can put 5 copies of any creature in this format on the board, it's hard to lose, especially when that creature is something like Gutter Snipe, something like Young Pyromancer, something like Spellbound Dragon. 5 copies of any of these creatures on your side, or 5 copies of any of your opponent's strongest creatures. It's very, very hard to lose after that. And Blatant Thievery, one of the strongest cards for EDH multiplayer, Commander multiplayer. You get 1 permanent from each of your opponents. It doesn't seem as strong for the mana cost when you first look at it, but once it's played and you're in a game where it happens to you, you really understand how strong it is. You lose your best thing, pretty much, and not only do you lose it, this deck will gain control of it. And it's very much synergizes with this deck's ability to use your opponent's cards against them. This deck typically wins with one of its own combos, but I have won on several occasions by pulling out some of my opponent's cards and copying them or taking extra turns with them under my control and winning that way.